Hey there. Welcome back to English in Fluency, the podcast where we don't just talk about English, we practice it together, out loud, right here, right now. I'm your host, Alex, and I am so glad you pressed play on this one today, because this episode is all about something that so many of you have been asking me for, which is confidence. Real, honest, in the moment, confidence when you're speaking English at the intermediate level, or what we call B1. So if you've ever frozen up in the middle of a sentence, or you've had a great idea in your head, but it just wouldn't come out of your mouth the way you wanted it to, then you are exactly who this episode was made for. Today we're going to slow things down. We're going to build you up piece by piece. And by the end of this episode, you are going to have a whole toolkit of natural, everyday phrases that will help you talk like a confident intermediate speaker. Not a nervous beginner, and not someone who's overthinking every single word. Are you ready to dive in? Let's get started. Let's talk for a second about what B1 actually means, because I think a lot of learners hear intermediate and they either feel proud, like, okay, I'm not a beginner anymore, or they feel stuck, like I've been at this level forever and I don't know how to move forward. And honestly, both of those feelings are completely normal. B1 means you can handle everyday conversations. You can talk about your job, your family, your hobbies, your weekend plans. You can describe things that happen to you. You can give simple opinions, and you can generally get your point across even if you don't have every single grammar rule perfectly memorized. But here's the secret that nobody tells you. The difference between a B1 speaker who sounds nervous and hesitant and a B1 speaker who sounds confident and fluent is not actually about grammar at all. It's about rhythm. It's about having ready-made phrases you can reach for automatically. And it's about not being afraid of small mistakes. So that's exactly what we do building today. Let's start right at the foundation, which is talking about yourself. This sounds simple, right? But so many learners actually trip up here because they either say too little, like just, I'm a teacher, and then silence. Or they try to say something too complicated, and they get lost halfway through the sentence. So let's build a natural, flowing way to introduce yourself that still sounds like you, not like a textbook. Instead of just saying your job, try adding a little extra detail that shows personality. For example, you could say, I work as a graphic designer, and I've actually been doing it for about 5 years now. Notice how that sentence flows? It's not just a fact, it's a small story. Repeat that after me. I work as a graphic designer, and I've actually been doing it for about 5 years now. Good. Now let's try another one. Maybe you're a student. You could say, I'm currently studying business at university. And to be honest, it's a lot more interesting than I expected. Repeat that. I'm currently studying business at university. And to be honest, it's a lot more interesting than I expected. See how the phrase "to be honest" adds a little personal color to the sentence? That's exactly the kind of small addition that makes you sound like a real person having a real conversation, instead of someone reciting facts. Now, let's move into daily routines, because this comes up constantly in real conversations. People ask, "What's your day like?" Or, "What do you usually do?" Way more often than you'd think. especially in small talk situations like at work, on a plane, or meeting someone new. The key here is using natural time expressions, things like usually, normally, most days, every once in a while. Let's build a sentence together. Instead of the flat, textbook-style answer like I wake up, I eat breakfast, I go to work, which sounds a bit robotic if I'm honest. Try connecting it into a flowing routine. You could say, most mornings, I wake up around 7. And after I've had my coffee, I usually head straight to the gym before work. Repeat that with me. Most mornings, I wake up around 7. And after I've had my coffee, I usually head straight to the gym before work. Do you feel the difference? It sounds like a real habit, not a checklist. Let's do one more. Maybe about your evenings. In the evenings, I try to unwind a bit, so I'll usually watch something on Netflix or catch up with friends on the phone. Repeat that. In the evenings, I try to unwind a bit, so I'll usually watch something on Netflix or catch up with friends on the phone. Perfect. Notice that little phrase, I try to. It's incredibly useful because it shows intention without sounding overly certain. And native speakers use it constantly. Okay, let's move into something that's going to massively boost your confidence, which is expressing opinions. A lot of B1 learners know grammar for opinions, but they only know one phrase, which is usually I think, and they use it for absolutely everything, over and over again, until it starts to sound repetitive. So let's expand your opinion toolkit right now. Instead of always saying, I think, you can say, in my opinion, which works the exact same way, just at the start of a sentence. For example, in my opinion, learning a language is more about consistency than talent. Repeat that. In my opinion, learning a language is more about consistency than talent. Now, let's try another option. I'd say that, which is a bit more casual and conversational. For example, I'd say that living in a big city has its pros and cons. Repeat that. I'd say that living in a big city has its pros and cons. And one more, which is great for slightly stronger opinions. I honestly believe, or just, I believe. For example, I honestly believe that practice matters way more than perfection. Repeat that. I honestly believe that practice matters way more than perfection. Now you've got 4 different ways to start an opinion instead of just one. And mixing these up naturally is exactly what makes your speaking sound less repetitive and more fluent. Now, opinions are only half the conversation, because in real life, people respond to what you say, and you need to respond back. So let's talk about agreeing and disagreeing, because this is where a lot of B1 speakers get stuck, either agreeing with everything just to avoid conflict, or not knowing how to disagree politely. Let's start with agreeing. The most basic way is I agree. But you can make it sound more natural by adding a little extra. For example, yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Repeat that. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. You could also say, that's exactly what I was thinking. Repeat that. That's exactly what I was thinking. Now for disagreeing, and this is important, because you don't want to sound rude or too direct, especially in a new language. A great phrase is, I see what you mean, but I'm not sure I completely agree. Repeat that. I see what you mean, but I'm not sure I completely agree. This phrase is amazing because it acknowledges the other person first, which is polite, and then gently introduces your different opinion. Another option is, "That's a fair point, although I'd look at it a bit differently." Repeat that. "That's a fair point, although I'd look at it a bit differently." These phrases give you the confidence to disagree without feeling like you're being harsh or impolite, which is honestly one of the biggest fears learners have. Let's shift gears and talk about likes, dislikes, and preferences, because this comes up in almost every single conversation. Whether you're talking about food, music, movies, or even just how you like to spend your weekend. A lot of learners only use "I like" and "I don't like," which is fine, but it gets boring fast, and it doesn't show much personality. So let's add some variety. Instead of "I like," try "I'm really into," which sounds more natural and enthusiastic. For example, "I'm really into hiking lately, especially now that the weather's getting nicer." Repeat that. "I'm really into hiking lately, especially now that the weather's getting nicer." For dislikes, instead of the flat "I don't like," try "I'm not really into," which softens it a bit and sounds more conversational. For example, "I'm not really into horror movies. They're just not my thing." Repeat that. "I'm not really into horror movies. They're just not my thing." And for preferences, when you're choosing between two things, "I'd rather" is incredibly useful. For example, honestly, "I'd rather stay in and cook than go out to a restaurant." Repeat that. Honestly, "I'd rather stay in and cook than go out to a restaurant." These small changes, from like to into, from don't like to not really into, make you sound noticeably more fluent, and it's such a small change to make. Now let's talk about past experiences, because this is another huge part of everyday conversation, and it's also where grammar and confidence tend to collide the most. You've probably learned the difference between past simple and present perfect in a classroom. But using it naturally in conversation is a different skill entirely. Here's a simple way to think about it that will help your speaking, not just your grammar homework. When someone asks, "Have you ever," they want to know about your life experience in general, not a specific time. So the question might be, "Have you ever traveled outside your country?" And a natural, confident answer connects the present perfect with a follow-up detail in past simple. For example, "Yes, I have. Actually, I went to Italy last summer, and it was honestly one of the best trips of my life." Repeat that. "Yes, I have. Actually, I went to Italy last summer, and it was honestly one of the best trips of my life." Do you notice the pattern? "Have you ever" opens the door with present perfect, and then you walk through that door with past simple details: the when, the where, the what happened. Let's try one more. Have you ever tried learning an instrument? And you might answer, "I have. Actually, I picked up the guitar a couple of years ago, but I'll admit, I haven't kept up with it as much as I should." Repeat that. "I have. Actually, I picked up the guitar a couple of years ago, but I'll admit, I haven't kept up with it as much as I should." This pattern alone, present perfect to open, past simple to add detail, is one of the single most useful patterns you can practice for sounding like a natural, confident speaker. Let's move on to something incredibly practical, which is talking about problems and giving advice, because this shows up constantly in real conversations, whether it's a friend venting about work stress or you asking for suggestions about something in your own life. First, let's talk about describing a problem naturally. Instead of just stating a fact like I have a problem, try softening it into a conversational lead in "the thing is," which is used constantly by native speakers. For example, "The thing is, I've been so busy at work lately that I haven't had time to relax at all." Repeat that. "The thing is, I've been so busy at work lately that I haven't had time to relax at all." Now, when someone shares a problem with you, giving advice confidently is a fantastic skill to have. The most direct way is "you should," which works well, but can sometimes sound a little strong depending on tone. For example, "You should really try to set some time aside just for yourself." Repeat that. "You should really try to set some time aside just for yourself." A softer, more suggestion-based option is "why don't you?" which sounds more like a friendly idea than a command. For example, "Why don't you try waking up a bit earlier, just to get some quiet time before the day starts?" Repeat that. "Why don't you try waking up a bit earlier, just to get some quiet time before the day starts?" And one more great option, especially for more gentle advice, is "maybe you could," which is soft, thoughtful, and doesn't feel pushy at all. For example, "Maybe you could talk to your manager about adjusting your workload a little." Repeat that. "Maybe you could talk to your manager about adjusting your workload a little." Having these three levels, "you should" for direct advice, "why don't you" for a casual suggestion, and "maybe you could" for gentle advice, gives you flexibility depending on the situation and how close you are with the person you're talking to. Now, let's talk about the future, because this is one area where B1 learners often overthink the grammar rules so much that they forget to just talk naturally. There are three common ways to talk about the future in English, and, honestly, in real conversation, native speakers move between them pretty freely, without thinking too hard about which rule applies. The first is going to, which we use for plans and intentions, things you've already decided. For example, "I'm going to visit my parents this weekend. We're planning a little family dinner." Repeat that. "I'm going to visit my parents this weekend. We're planning a little family dinner." The second is present continuous, which we often use for more fixed, scheduled plans, especially with a specific time or date. For example, "I'm meeting a friend for coffee tomorrow at 11. Repeat that. "I'm meeting a friend for coffee tomorrow at 11. And the third is will, which we typically use for more spontaneous decisions, predictions, or promises. For example, "I think it'll probably rain later, so I'll bring an umbrella just in case." Repeat that. "I think it'll probably rain later, so I'll bring an umbrella just in case." Don't stress too much about memorizing the exact rule for each one in the moment of conversation. The more you practice these patterns out loud, the more they'll start to feel automatic. And that automatic feeling is exactly what confidence sounds like. Let's talk about storytelling now, because being able to tell a short story about your weekend, a funny thing that happened, or an experience from your past is one of the most impressive things you can do as an intermediate speaker. It instantly makes you sound more fluent because stories have natural structure. And once you learn the structure, the vocabulary just fills itself in. A good story usually has 4 parts, so let's build one together using simple connecting words. First, you set the scene, using something like, "So, this happened a couple of weeks ago." Repeat that. "So, this happened a couple of weeks ago." Then you add the first event, using first or at first. For example, "At first, everything was going totally fine." Repeat that. "At first, everything was going totally fine." Then you add what happened next, using then or after that. For example, "Then, out of nowhere, it just started pouring rain." Repeat that. "Then, out of nowhere, it just started pouring rain." And finally, you wrap it up with a result or reaction, using "in the end" or "so in the end." For example, "So in the end, we just laughed about it and grabbed some coffee to warm up." Repeat that. "So in the end, we just laughed about it and grabbed some coffee to warm up." Now let's put the whole story together as one flowing piece. And I want you to notice how natural it sounds, even though it's built from simple pieces. So, this happened a couple of weeks ago. At first, everything was going totally fine. We were just walking around downtown. Then, out of nowhere, it just started pouring rain, and neither of us had an umbrella. So, in the end, we just laughed about it and grabbed some coffee to warm up. Isn't that such a satisfying little story? And every single piece of it is B1 level vocabulary. Nothing complicated. It's just connected really smoothly. Speaking of connecting things smoothly, let's talk about linking words, because these are honestly some of the most underrated tools in the entire English language. Linking words are what take you from short, choppy sentences to longer, more natural, more fluent-sounding sentences. Let's go through a few of the most useful ones. Because is used to give a reason, and it's incredibly common. For example, "I didn't go out last night because I was feeling pretty tired." Repeat that. "I didn't go out last night because I was feeling pretty tired." So is used to show a result. For example, "I was tired, so I just stayed home and relaxed." Repeat that. "I was tired, so I just stayed home and relaxed." Although, or even though, is used to show a contrast or unexpected result. And this one especially makes you sound more advanced when you use it well. For example, "Although I was tired, I still went to the gym." Repeat that. "Although I was tired, I still went to the gym." And however, which is a bit more formal, but still very useful, especially at the start of a new sentence to show contrast. For example, "The weather wasn't great today. However, we still had a really nice time." Repeat that. "The weather wasn't great today. However, we still had a really nice time." Practicing these connectors regularly is genuinely one of the fastest ways to level up from choppy B1 sentences to smooth, natural-sounding speech. Now here's something that almost nobody teaches in a classroom, but it makes a massive difference in how confident and natural you sound. And that's using filler words and thinking phrases. A lot of learners think that pausing or using filler words means they're not fluent, but actually, it's the complete opposite. Native speakers use fillers constantly. They're not a weakness. They're a tool that gives your brain a second to think, while still sounding natural and keeping the conversation flowing. Let's go through a few essential ones. Well, at the start of a sentence is great for when you're about to answer a question and need a tiny second to organize your thoughts. For example, if someone asks, "What do you think about the new project?" you might say, "Well, I think it has a lot of potential. But there are definitely some challenges." Repeat that. "Well, I think it has a lot of potential, but there are definitely some challenges." You know, is another one, used to add a little casual pause or to check that the listener understands. For example, it was, you know, one of those days where nothing really goes as planned. Repeat that. It was, one of those days where nothing really goes as planned. Actually is fantastic for correcting yourself or adding a surprising detail. For example, I was going to stay home, but actually, I ended up going to the party anyway. Repeat that. I was going to stay home, but actually, I ended up going to the party anyway. And I mean, is perfect for clarifying or rephrasing something you just said. For example, it was fine. I mean, it wasn't amazing, but it was fine. Repeat that. It was fine. I mean, it wasn't amazing, but it was fine. These fillers give your brain breathing room, and honestly, they make you sound more natural, not less. So, don't be afraid to use them. Let's take a moment now to talk about some common mistakes that B1 learners make. Not to make you feel bad about them, but because once you're aware of them, they become so much easier to fix. One really common mistake is translating directly from your native language, word for word, which often creates sentences that are grammatically okay, but just don't sound natural to a native speaker. The fix for this is exposure. Listening to natural English regularly, just like you're doing right now, and slowly training your ear to recognize what sounds right. Another common mistake is overusing very basic vocabulary, like good, bad, nice, in every single sentence. A simple fix is building a small collection of alternative words. So, instead of always saying good, you could say pretty solid, or really enjoyable, depending on the context. Another mistake, and this one is huge, is staying completely silent when you don't know a word, instead of describing around it. If you forget the word umbrella, for example, you can just say that thing you use when it rains, and keep the conversation moving. Repeat that idea. That thing you use when it rains. This skill, called circumlocution, or just talking around a word, is honestly one of the most valuable fluency skills you can develop, because it means a missing word never has to stop your conversation completely. Now let's talk a little bit about pronunciation and intonation, because even with perfect grammar, if your rhythm and stress patterns don't sound natural, it can be harder for listeners to understand you smoothly. And it can also make you sound less confident than you actually are. One of the biggest things to focus on at B1 level is sentence stress, which means emphasizing the important words in a sentence, usually the content words like nouns, main verbs, adjectives, while saying the smaller connecting words like is, the, a bit more quickly and softly. Let's practice this with a sentence. I really enjoyed the movie last night. Notice how the stress falls on really, enjoyed, movie, and night. Those are the important, meaningful words, while the and last are said more quickly. Repeat that with the stress pattern. I really enjoyed the movie last night. Doing this makes your speech sound much more musical and natural, instead of flat, where every single word gets equal emphasis, which is actually one of the biggest signs of a non-native rhythm. Also, remember that in questions, especially yes or no questions, your voice typically rises at the end. For example, did you have a good weekend? Repeat that, with your voice rising at the end. Did you have a good weekend? And for information questions, the ones starting with what, where, why, how. The voice usually falls slightly at the end, which actually sounds more confident and definite. For example, what did you do this weekend? Repeat that, with a slight fall at the end. What did you do this weekend? Practicing this rising and falling pattern. Even just by repeating sentences out loud like we're doing now, trains your mouth and your ear together, and that combination is really where fluency comes from. Let's bring a lot of these tools together now with a short role-play conversation, so you can hear how all of these phrases sound when they're used naturally, back and forth, the way a real conversation actually flows. I'm going to play both sides of this conversation, so listen closely, and afterward, I want you to try saying both parts yourself, out loud, pausing the episode if you need to. Here we go. Hey, how was your weekend? Honestly, it was pretty good, actually. I went hiking with a friend on Saturday, and the weather was surprisingly nice. Oh, really? Have you ever done that trail before? The one near the lake? I have, actually, a couple of times. But this was the first time in autumn. And honestly, the colors were incredible. That sounds amazing. I'd love to go sometime. I'm really into hiking lately, too. You definitely should. Actually, why don't you come with us next time? We're planning to go again in a couple of weeks. I'd love that. What time do you guys usually head out? Well, we usually leave pretty early, around 7, just to beat the crowds. That works for me. I'll set an alarm. I'll definitely try to. Now, did you notice how naturally all of those phrases fit together? Honestly, have you ever? I have. Actually, I'd love to. Why don't you? Well, they weren't forced. They just flowed as part of a normal, relaxed conversation. That's exactly the sound we're building toward. I want to spend a little time now talking about confidence itself. Because honestly, the phrases and grammar are only half the story. The other half is mindset. And this part matters just as much, maybe even more. So many B1 learners actually know more English than they think they do. But fear of making a mistake keeps them quiet, or keeps them translating every single sentence perfectly in their head before speaking, which slows everything down and actually makes conversation harder, not easier. So here's something I want you to really take in. Mistakes are not a sign that you're bad at English. Mistakes are proof that you're actually using English, actively, in real time, which is the only way to genuinely improve. Every fluent speaker you've ever admired made thousands, honestly, probably tens of thousands, of small mistakes along the way. The difference between them and someone who stays stuck is that they kept talking anyway. So here's a practical tip. Try speaking out loud to yourself. In English. Even when you're alone. Describing your day. Giving your opinion about something you watched. or just narrating what you're doing while you make dinner. It might feel a little strange at first. I totally understand that. But it trains your mouth and your brain to produce English without the pressure of another person listening. And that pressure release is honestly huge for building real, spontaneous confidence. Another tip that I really believe in is recording yourself speaking, just using your phone, once a week even, talking for 1 or 2 minutes about anything, your weekend, your opinion on something, a random topic. Don't worry about it being perfect. The point isn't to create something polished. The point is to notice your own patterns, where you hesitate, which words you avoid, where your sentences trail off. And here's the beautiful part. When you listen back a month later, you will genuinely hear the improvement. Because progress in speaking is often invisible day to day. But it becomes really clear when you compare recordings over time. I promise you, that kind of evidence is incredibly motivating, especially on days when you feel like you're not improving at all. Which, by the way, every single language learner feels sometimes. So please don't think that feeling means something is wrong. Now let's put everything together with a practice challenge for this episode, because listening is fantastic, but speaking is where the real growth happens. I want you to take just 3 minutes today. Set a timer if that helps, and talk out loud. By yourself or with a study partner if you have one. About your typical week. Try to use at least one phrase from each section we covered today. Start by introducing a little bit about yourself. Then describe your daily routine. Share an opinion about something, whether you agree or disagree with it. Mention something you like or don't particularly enjoy. Tell a small story about something that happened recently. And finish with a plan you have for the future. It sounds like a lot. But honestly, once you start talking, it flows much more naturally than you'd expect. Especially now that you have all of these phrases fresh in your mind. And remember, you don't need perfect grammar. You just need to keep talking. Keep the rhythm going. And use those fillers like well, and actually, and I mean, whenever you need a second to think, because that is exactly what confident, natural speakers do. Let's go a little deeper now and talk about work and career, because this is one of those topics that comes up in almost every single conversation with someone new, whether it's a coworker, a stranger at a party, or someone you just met at a language exchange. A lot of learners can say their job title just fine, but they freeze the moment someone asks a follow-up question, like, so, what's that actually like? So, let's build some natural ways to talk about your work in a little more depth. You could say, I work in marketing, and what I really enjoy about it is that every day looks a little different. Repeat that. I work in marketing, and what I really enjoy about it is that every day looks a little different. Notice that little phrase. What I really enjoy about it. It's a fantastic bridge that lets you move from a simple fact into a more personal, detailed answer. And it works for almost any topic. Not just jobs. Let's try one about something you find challenging at work. Because honestly, sharing a small challenge makes you sound more genuine and relatable than pretending everything is perfect. You could say, honestly, the most challenging part is probably managing my time. There's always more to do than hours in the day. Repeat that. Honestly, the most challenging part is probably managing my time. There's always more to do than hours in the day. And if someone asks whether you enjoy your job overall, instead of a flat yes or no, try. For the most part, I really do. Although there are definitely days when it's stressful. Like any job, I guess. Repeat that. For the most part, I really do. Although there are definitely days when it's stressful. Like any job, I guess. That little addition, like any job, I guess, makes your answer sound balanced and thoughtful, rather than either overly positive or overly negative. Now, let's talk about describing people. Because whether you're talking about a friend, a coworker, or someone you just met, this is a skill that comes up constantly. And it's also a great way to practice adjectives beyond the basic ones like nice and good. When describing someone's personality, try phrases like he's really easygoing, or she's incredibly hardworking. For example, my roommate is really easygoing. Honestly, nothing seems to stress him out. Repeat that. My roommate is really easygoing. Honestly, nothing seems to stress him out. When describing appearance, it's natural to combine a couple of details smoothly, rather than listing them one by one. For example, instead of she has brown hair, she is tall, she wears glasses, which sounds choppy and unnatural. Try, she's pretty tall, with brown hair, and she usually wears glasses. Repeat that. She's pretty tall, with brown hair, and she usually wears glasses. Combining details with commas and natural connectors, like with instantly makes your description sound smoother and more like something a native speaker would actually say in conversation, rather than a list from a textbook exercise. Let's talk about feelings and emotions now, because being able to express how you feel and ask others how they feel is honestly one of the most human parts of any conversation, and it builds real connection with the person you're talking to. Beyond just happy or sad, let's add a few more natural options. For excitement, you could say, I'm really looking forward to it. I can't wait. Actually, repeat that. I'm really looking forward to it. I can't wait. Actually, for nervousness, try, I'm a little nervous about it, if I'm honest. But I think it'll be fine. Repeat that. I'm a little nervous about it, if I'm honest. But I think it'll be fine. For feeling overwhelmed, which is such a common feeling to want to express. Try. Things have been pretty overwhelming lately. There's just a lot going on. Repeat that. Things have been pretty overwhelming lately. There's just a lot going on. And when someone shares a feeling with you, a warm, natural response is, that makes total sense. Or I totally get that. For example, if a friend says they're nervous about a job interview, you could respond, that makes total sense. Interviews are stressful for pretty much everyone. Repeat that. That makes total sense. Interviews are stressful for pretty much everyone. These small, empathetic responses make conversations feel warmer and more natural. And they show that you're really listening, not just waiting for your turn to talk. Now, let's explore something that often feels intimidating to B1 learners, which is talking about hypothetical situations, imaginary or unreal scenarios, using would. A lot of learners avoid this structure because it feels grammatically complex. But honestly, once you get a feel for the rhythm, It becomes one of the most natural-sounding structures in casual conversation. A classic pattern is, "If I were you, I would," which is used constantly when giving advice or imagining yourself in someone else's situation. For example, "If I were you, I'd probably just talk to him directly about it." Repeat that. "If I were you, I'd probably just talk to him directly about it." Another really common use is imagining a different life or decision, using "I would" on its own. For example, "If I had more free time, I'd probably learn how to paint. I've always wanted to try it." Repeat that. "If I had more free time, I'd probably learn how to paint. I've always wanted to try it." And a great question to practice this with friends is, "What would you do if you won the lottery?" Which is such a fun, common conversation starter. You might answer, "Honestly, I'd probably travel for a year before doing anything else." Repeat that. "Honestly, I'd probably travel for a year before doing anything else." Don't worry too much about the technical grammar term for this. Conditional sentences. Second conditional, whatever you want to call it. What matters most right now is getting comfortable with the rhythm and sound of "if I were" and "I would," because that rhythm is what will make it come out naturally in real conversations. Let's talk about small talk now, because starting and ending conversations smoothly is honestly a skill all on its own, separate from grammar entirely. Great small talk starters include commenting on something in the shared environment, like the weather or an event. For example, "Can you believe how nice the weather's been lately?" Repeat that. "Can you believe how nice the weather's been lately?" Or, in a work setting, "How's your week been so far?" Repeat that. "How's your week been so far?" These questions are wonderful because they're low pressure and almost anyone can answer them easily, which keeps the conversation flowing naturally without putting anyone on the spot. Now, ending a conversation politely is just as important as starting one. And a lot of learners either end conversations too abruptly, or they don't know how to end them at all, and the conversation just kind of trails off awkwardly. A natural way to close things out is, "Well, it was really great catching up. I should probably get going, though." Repeat that. "Well, it was really great catching up. I should probably get going, though." Or, in a more casual setting, "Anyway, I'll let you go, but it was really nice talking to you." Repeat that. "Anyway, I'll let you go, but it was really nice talking to you." These closing phrases feel warm and natural, and they give the conversation a clear, comfortable ending instead of an awkward silence. Let's touch briefly on talking about health, because this comes up more often than you'd think. Whether someone asks how you're feeling, or you need to explain that you're not feeling well. If you're not feeling great, instead of just saying "I'm sick," which is fine, but very basic, you could say, "I've been feeling a bit under the weather the last couple of days." Repeat that. "I've been feeling a bit under the weather the last couple of days." That phrase, "under the weather," is a lovely, very natural English expression for feeling slightly unwell, and using idioms like this, even just occasionally, makes your English sound noticeably more natural and native. Like, if you're recovering, you could say, "I'm feeling a lot better now. Thanks, just needed some rest." Repeat that. "I'm feeling a lot better now. Thanks. Just needed some rest. And if someone tells you they're not feeling well, a warm, caring response is, "Oh no, I hope you feel better soon." Repeat that. "Oh no, I hope you feel better soon." Small phrases like this show warmth and care in a conversation. And honestly, those small human touches are just as important to fluency as grammar accuracy. Let's build a second role-play dialogue now, this time using some of these newer phrases, so you can really hear how naturally they all fit together in a real back-and-forth conversation. Again, I'll play both sides, and I want you to repeat both parts yourself, out loud, at your own pace. Here we go. Hey, how's your week been so far? Pretty good. Actually, a little busy with work. But I can't complain. Yeah? What's that like? The busy season at your job? Honestly, the most challenging part is just managing my time. There's always more to do than hours in the day. I totally get that. If I were you, I'd try to take at least one evening off this week, just to recharge. That's probably a good idea. Actually, I've been feeling a bit under the weather too, so some rest would help. Oh no, I hope you feel better soon. Anyway, I'll let you go. But it was really nice talking to you. You too. Take care. Do you hear how naturally those phrases blended together? What's that like? I totally get that. If I were you, under the weather. I'll let you go. None of it sounds forced. It just sounds like two people genuinely talking. And that natural blending is exactly the sound we're training your mouth and brain to produce. Let's go a little deeper into pronunciation now, because there's one more piece that makes a huge difference at the B1 level, and that's word stress within individual words, especially longer ones. In English, every word with more than one syllable has one syllable that gets stronger emphasis than the others, and stressing the wrong syllable can genuinely make it harder for people to understand a word, even if every sound in it is technically correct. Let's practice a few common ones. The word comfortable is stressed on the first syllable. Comfortable. Not comfortable. Repeat that. Comfortable. The word interesting is stressed on the first syllable too. Interesting. Repeat that. Interesting. And the word photography shifts the stress compared to photograph. It becomes photography. Repeat that. Photography. Don't worry. You don't need to memorize the stress pattern of every single word in English. That's genuinely not realistic for anyone, even advanced learners. But what you can do is pay attention when you're listening to podcasts, shows, or videos, and notice where the stress falls on words you use often. And then practice saying those specific words out loud a few times until the stress pattern feels natural in your mouth. One more pronunciation tool that's incredibly useful at this level is linking, which is when the end of one word connects smoothly into the beginning of the next word, rather than pausing between every single word like a robot. For example, an apple isn't said as two separate, choppy words. It flows together as an apple, with the N sound connecting smoothly to apple. Repeat that. An apple. Similarly, turn it off often flows together as turn it off in natural, fast speech, rather than four separate, distinct words. Repeat that. Turn it off. This linking is exactly why native speech can sometimes sound so fast and blended to learners. It's not that the words themselves are complicated. It's that they flow together in ways that aren't obvious from just reading them on a page. The good news is, the more you listen and repeat natural speech, exactly like we're practicing in this episode, the more your own mouth naturally starts to link words together too, without even having to think about it consciously. Let's talk about a few more common mistakes before we wrap up, because I want you to leave this episode with a really clear, practical checklist in your mind. One common mistake is overusing the word very instead of reaching for a stronger, more specific word. Instead of very tired, you could say exhausted. Instead of very happy, you could say thrilled or delighted. For example, I was absolutely exhausted after the trip, but it was totally worth it. Repeat that. I was absolutely exhausted after the trip, but it was totally worth it. Another common mistake is forgetting to soften direct statements in conversation, which can sometimes come across as more blunt than intended, even if that's not the goal at all. Adding small softeners like kind of, a little, or I guess, makes your speech sound more natural and less abrupt. For example, instead of, it was boring, you could say, it was kind of boring. If I'm honest, repeat that. It was kind of boring, if I'm honest. And one final, really common mistake is avoiding contractions, saying I am, do not, cannot, in every single sentence, which, while completely grammatically correct, sounds overly formal and stiff in casual conversation. Native speakers use contractions constantly in everyday speech. I'm, don't, can't. And using them yourself instantly makes your English sound more relaxed and natural. For example, I don't think I can make it tonight. I'm honestly pretty tired. Repeat that. I don't think I can make it tonight. I'm honestly pretty tired. Now let's expand our practice challenge a little further, because I want you to walk away from this episode with something really concrete to work on this week, not just today. In addition to the 3-minute talk we discussed earlier, I want you to try one more thing: having a short, imaginary conversation with yourself covering 3 different topics. Describing a person you know well, using at least 2 personality adjectives. Talking about a hypothetical situation using if I were or I would. And practicing a small talk opener and a polite way to end a conversation. You can do this out loud in the shower, on a walk, or while cooking dinner, wherever feels comfortable and low pressure for you. The goal isn't perfection at all. The goal is simply repetition. Because every single time you say these patterns out loud, they become a tiny bit more automatic. And automatic is exactly where true fluency lives. Let's talk about food and restaurants for a moment, because honestly, this might be one of the most common conversation topics in the entire English-speaking world. Ordering food, recommending a restaurant, describing a meal. These situations come up constantly, whether you're traveling, meeting friends, or just chatting about weekend plans. When recommending a place to eat, instead of the flat, it's good. Try something a bit richer. Like, honestly, the food there is amazing, and the portions are pretty generous too. Repeat that. Honestly, the food there is amazing, and the portions are pretty generous too. When describing a dish you tried, you could say, I had the pasta, and it was so flavorful, way better than I expected. Repeat that. I had the pasta, and it was so flavorful, way better than I expected. And if you didn't love something, instead of a harsh, "It was bad," which can sound a bit blunt. Try, "It wasn't really my thing. To be honest, a bit too salty for my taste." Repeat that. "It wasn't really my thing. To be honest, a bit too salty for my taste." Notice how "a bit too" followed by an adjective is such a useful, gentle way to express a mild complaint without sounding overly negative. And it's a pattern you can use for almost anything. Not just food. A movie that was a bit too long, or a room that was a bit too cold. Let's move on to giving directions. Because even though we all rely on our phones for maps these days, being asked for directions in English, especially if you're living or traveling somewhere English-speaking, is still a really common real-world situation. And it's a fantastic confidence builder because it forces you to think and speak quickly, in the moment. Some essential phrases here include "go straight," "turn left," "turn right," and "it's on your right," or "it's on your left." Let's build a natural-sounding set of directions together. You could say, "Okay, so you're going to go straight for about 2 blocks, and then you'll want to turn left at the traffic light." Repeat that. "Okay, so you're going to go straight for about 2 blocks, and then you'll want to turn left at the traffic light." Then you might continue. "From there, it's just a short walk, and you'll see it on your right, right next to the pharmacy." Repeat that. "From there, it's just a short walk, and you'll see it on your right, right next to the pharmacy." And if you genuinely don't know the way, which happens to everyone, a perfectly natural, honest response is, "Sorry, I'm actually not from around here, but I think there might be a map just up ahead." Repeat that. "Sorry, I'm actually not from around here, but I think there might be a map just up ahead." There's no shame at all in not knowing. The important thing is being able to respond naturally and keep the conversation moving smoothly, rather than freezing up. Let's talk about discussing news and current events, because at the B1 level, this can feel a little intimidating, since it often involves more abstract or unfamiliar vocabulary. But honestly, you don't need to be an expert on a topic to have a natural, comfortable conversation about it. A great way to start is by acknowledging you've heard something without necessarily knowing every single detail. For example, "I saw something about that in the news, but I don't know all the details, to be honest." Repeat that. "I saw something about that in the news, but I don't know all the details, to be honest." When sharing a general opinion on a bigger topic, hedging a little is completely normal and very natural, even for native speakers. For example, "I don't know a ton about the topic, but from what I understand, it seems like a pretty complicated situation." Repeat that. "I don't know a ton about the topic, but from what I understand, it seems like a pretty complicated situation." And if you'd simply rather not discuss something, which is also totally fine, a polite way to redirect the conversation is, "Honestly, I try not to follow the news too closely. It can be a bit much sometimes." Repeat that. "Honestly, I try not to follow the news too closely. It can be a bit much sometimes." These phrases give you graceful, natural ways to participate in, or gently step back from, more complex conversation topics, without feeling pressured to have a fully formed expert opinion on everything. Now, let's talk about technology, because This is another topic that comes up constantly in modern conversation. Whether it's talking about your phone, an app you're using, or even something like artificial intelligence, which, let's be honest, comes up in almost every conversation these days. When talking about a new piece of technology, you could say, "I've been using this new app, and honestly, it's made my mornings so much easier." Repeat that. "I've been using this new app, and honestly, it's made my mornings so much easier." When expressing mixed feelings about technology, which is incredibly common and relatable, you might say, "I have kind of mixed feelings about it. It's really convenient, but it can be a bit overwhelming too." Repeat that. "I have kind of mixed feelings about it. It's really convenient, but it can be a bit overwhelming too." And if you're not familiar with something someone mentions, a completely natural response is, "I haven't really looked into that yet. What's it like?" Repeat that. "I haven't really looked into that yet. What's it like?" That little question, "What's it like?" is incredibly versatile, and you can use it to ask about literally anything: a new gadget, a new job, a new city, a new restaurant. It always sounds natural and genuinely curious. Let's talk about expressing surprise, because this is such a natural, human reaction. And having a few solid ways to express it makes your conversations feel much more alive and engaged, rather than flat. The most basic option is, "Really?" which works perfectly well. But let's add a few more colorful options to your toolkit. "No way. That's crazy," is a great casual option for genuine surprise. For example, if a friend tells you they just got a new job, you might respond, "No way. That's crazy. Congratulations." Repeat that. "No way. That's crazy. Congratulations. I had no idea," is perfect for when you're surprised to learn a new piece of information. For example, "I had no idea you used to live in Spain. That's so interesting." Repeat that. "I had no idea you used to live in Spain. That's so interesting. And wow, I wasn't expecting that." Works beautifully for slightly bigger, more unexpected news. For example, "Wow, I wasn't expecting that at all. How are you feeling about it?" Repeat that. "Wow, I wasn't expecting that at all. How are you feeling about it?" Notice that last example also included a natural follow-up question. "How are you feeling about it?" which is a great habit to build. Respond in with genuine curiosity, not just a flat reaction. Keeps conversations flowing naturally instead of stalling out after one exchange. Let's build one more role-play dialogue, our third one today, combining a lot of these newer topics together: food, technology, and a bit of surprise. So you can really hear the full natural rhythm one more time before we wrap up. Again, I'll play both roles, and afterward, go ahead and repeat both parts yourself, out loud, taking your time. Here we go. "Hey, guess what? I finally tried that new restaurant downtown." "Oh, really? What's it like?" "Honestly, the food there is amazing, and the portions are pretty generous too. You should definitely go sometime." "No way. That's crazy. I've been wanting to try it for weeks." "What did you order?" "I had the pasta, and it was so flavorful. Way better than I expected." "That sounds great. By the way, did you hear they're opening a second location?" "I had no idea. That's awesome. Honestly, it makes sense. The place was pretty packed." "Yeah, I saw something about it online, but I don't know all the details. To be honest, well, Either way, we should go together sometime. It's honestly worth it. Do you hear how those phrases from completely different topics, food, technology, surprise, all blended together seamlessly into one natural, flowing conversation? That's exactly what real conversations feel like. They jump between topics constantly, and that's completely normal. Let's spend a bit more time on pronunciation, specifically on intonation patterns when you're listing things in a sentence, because this is a small detail that makes a surprisingly big difference in how natural you sound. When you list several items in English, your voice typically rises slightly on each item, except the very last one, where it falls, signaling to the listener that the list has ended. For example, I need to buy some bread, some milk, some eggs, and some coffee. Notice how your voice would rise slightly after bread, after milk, after eggs, and then fall on coffee, signaling the end of the list. Repeat that, paying attention to that rising and falling pattern. I need to buy some bread, some milk, some eggs, and some coffee. This pattern might feel small, but it genuinely helps listeners follow your speech more easily. And it also just sounds more musical and natural, rather than flat and monotone, which can sometimes make speech harder to follow, even when the grammar itself is completely correct. Let's also talk briefly about the schwa sound, which is honestly one of the most important sounds in English, even though most learners have never even heard of it. The schwa is that soft, relaxed, a sound that appears in unstressed syllables, and it's incredibly common, way more common than people realize. For example, in the word banana, the first and last A sounds are both schwa sounds, soft and relaxed, while the middle syllable, ne, gets the stress. Repeat that. Banana. In the word about, the first syllable is a soft schwa sound too. About, not bout. Repeat that. About. Getting comfortable with this soft, relaxed sound in unstressed syllables is honestly one of the biggest secrets to sounding more natural. Because non-native speakers often try to pronounce every single syllable with full, equal clarity, which, ironically, ends up sounding less natural, not more, because native English rhythm relies heavily on these soft, quick, relaxed sounds in between the stressed syllables. Now, let's talk about one more incredibly useful conversational skill, which is asking good follow-up questions, because this single skill can transform you from someone who just answers questions into someone who actually carries a conversation forward naturally and confidently. A great, simple follow-up question after almost any statement is, "And how was that?" or "How did that go?" For example, if someone mentions they had a job interview last week, you could ask, "Oh, how did that go?" Repeat that. "Oh, how did that go?" Another versatile one is, "What made you decide that?" which shows genuine curiosity about someone's reasoning. For example, "That's interesting. What made you decide to make the switch?" Repeat that. "That's interesting. What made you decide to make the switch?" And a wonderful, warm one for almost any piece of news, good or bad, is simply, "How are you feeling about it?" which we actually touched on earlier too, because it works so well and so often. Building a habit of asking these kinds of open, caring follow-up questions makes you feel like a much more confident, engaged conversationalist, and honestly, People genuinely enjoy talking to someone who asks thoughtful questions. So this skill benefits your relationships just as much as it benefits your English fluency. Let's talk for a moment about handling situations where you simply don't understand something someone said. Because this happens to every single language learner, constantly. And having a graceful way to handle it is honestly a huge confidence booster. Instead of just nodding along and pretending to understand, which almost always backfires later in the conversation, try, "Sorry, could you say that one more time?" Repeat that. "Sorry, could you say that one more time?" Or, if you understood most of it but missed a specific word, "Sorry, what does that word mean?" The one you just used. Repeat that. "Sorry, what does that word mean?" The one you just used. And if you understood the words but not the overall point, "Sorry, I'm not sure I completely followed that. Could you explain it a little differently?" Repeat that. "Sorry, I'm not sure I completely followed that. Could you explain it a little differently?" Every native speaker, genuinely, has to ask people to repeat themselves regularly too, in their own language. It's a completely normal part of human conversation, not a sign of weak English skills. So please don't let any embarrassment around this stop you from asking for clarification when you need it. Let's expand our practice challenge one final time, bringing together everything from this entire episode into one comprehensive speaking exercise. This week, I want you to have one real conversation in English, even a short one, with a friend, a language partner, or even a stranger if the opportunity comes up. And try to naturally include at least 5 different tools from today's episode. An opinion phrase, a follow-up question, a filler word when you need a second to think, a softener like kind of or a little, and one storytelling connector like then, or after that. Don't try to force all of them into one single sentence. That would sound strange and unnatural. Just let them appear naturally throughout the conversation as it flows. And afterward, take just 2 minutes to reflect, either out loud to yourself or in a small notebook, on what felt natural and what still felt a little effortful. Because that kind of honest self-reflection is genuinely one of the fastest ways to keep improving, week after week. Let's talk about describing places, because whether it's your hometown, a city you visited, or even just your neighborhood, this is a topic that comes up naturally all the time. And it's a great chance to practice painting a picture with words instead of just stating flat facts. Instead of, "It's a nice city," which is fine, but pretty forgettable, try adding a specific detail that shows why. For example, "It's a really charming city. Honestly, there's this great mix of old architecture and modern cafes everywhere you look." Repeat that. "It's a really charming city. Honestly, there's this great mix of old architecture and modern cafes everywhere you look." When describing your hometown, you could say, "It's a pretty small town, but it's got a lot of character. Everyone kinda knows everyone." Repeat that. "It's a pretty small town, but it's got a lot of character. Everyone kinda knows everyone." And when recommending a place to visit, try, "If you ever get the chance, you should really check it out. It's totally worth the trip." Repeat that. "If you ever get the chance, you should really check it out. It's totally worth the trip." That phrase, "totally worth it," or "totally worth the trip," is incredibly flexible. and you'll find yourself using it constantly for restaurants, movies, experiences, honestly, almost anything you'd recommend to a friend. Let's also talk about weekend plans and free time in a bit more depth, because this is genuinely one of the most common small talk topics in the English-speaking world, right up there with the weather. When someone asks, "Any plans for the weekend?" a flat answer, like "No, nothing," kind of ends the conversation right there. So let's build something a little more natural and open-ended. You could say, "Nothing too exciting. Honestly, probably just relaxing at home. Maybe catching up on some shows." Repeat that. "Nothing too exciting. Honestly, probably just relaxing at home. Maybe catching up on some shows." Or, if you do have plans, "Actually, yeah. A few friends and I are planning to check out that new market downtown." Repeat that. "Actually, yeah. A few friends and I are planning to check out that new market downtown." And a wonderful way to keep the conversation flowing after answering is to turn the question right back around. "What about you? Any plans?" Repeat that. "What about you? Any plans?" This simple habit, answering and then asking the same question back, is honestly one of the easiest ways to keep a conversation feeling balanced and natural, instead of feeling like an interview where only one person is doing all the talking. Now let's talk about giving and asking for opinions in group settings, because this is a slightly different skill than the one-on-one opinion sharing we covered earlier. Since, in a group, you often want to invite quieter people into the conversation too, which is a wonderfully generous, natural thing to do. A great way to bring someone else in is, "What do you think?" Directed at someone specific? Or, "Do you feel the same way?" For example, "That's my take on it anyway. But what do you think?" Repeat that. "That's my take on it anyway. But what do you think?" And if you want to gently agree with part of what someone said, but add your own angle, try, "That's true. And I'd also add that," for example, "That's true. And I'd also add that timing probably played a big role too." Repeat that. "That's true. And I'd also add that timing probably played a big role too." These small group conversation skills, inviting others in, building on what someone said rather than just replacing it, make you sound like a genuinely thoughtful, socially aware speaker, which goes hand in hand with sounding fluent and confident. Before we move to the recap, let's cover one more genuinely essential set of phrases: making polite requests and apologizing naturally, because these come up in nearly every single day of life, at work, with friends, while traveling, pretty much everywhere. When making a request, instead of the very direct and, honestly, slightly abrupt sounding, "Give me," or "I want," which can come across as a bit blunt in English, even if that's not the intention at all, try, "Would you mind passing me that?" Repeat that. "Would you mind passing me that?" Or, for a slightly bigger request, "Do you think you could help me with this later?" Repeat that. "Do you think you could help me with this later?" These softer, more indirect forms are honestly the backbone of polite English, and using them regularly instantly makes you sound more considerate and fluent at the same time. Now, for apologizing, beyond the basic, "I'm sorry," which absolutely still works fine, you can add more natural variety. For a small mistake, try, "Oops, sorry about that." Repeat that. "Oops, sorry about that." For being late, try, Sorry, I'm running a little late. Traffic was pretty rough today. Repeat that. Sorry, I'm running a little late. Traffic was pretty rough today. And for a bigger apology, something more sincere. I'm really sorry about that. I honestly didn't mean for it to happen that way. Repeat that. I'm really sorry about that. I honestly didn't mean for it to happen that way. Having these different levels ready, small oops moments versus more sincere apologies, means you're never stuck searching for words in a moment that already feels a little uncomfortable, which is exactly when confidence matters most. Let's also spend a moment on something a little different, and that's talking about goals and personal growth. Because this topic comes up so often in real conversations, especially with friends, whether it's about learning English itself, fitness, career growth, or any personal project someone is working on. A natural way to talk about a goal is, I've been trying to get into a better routine lately. Honestly, it's a work in progress. Repeat that. I've been trying to get into a better routine lately. Honestly, it's a work in progress. That phrase, a work in progress, is a beautiful, humble, very natural way to talk about something you're still improving at, without pretending you've already mastered it. And honestly, it applies perfectly to learning English too. So feel free to use it about your own English journey. When talking about a goal you're proud of working toward, you could say, I've been really consistent with it lately, and I'm honestly pretty proud of how far I've come. Repeat that. I've been really consistent with it lately, and I'm honestly pretty proud of how far I've come. And that sentence, my friend, applies to you, right now, today, listening to this episode, because showing up consistently to practice, exactly like you're doing, is genuinely the entire secret to fluency. There really isn't a faster hidden shortcut hidden somewhere else. One last practical tool before we recap, and this one is a favorite of mine. Using kind of and sort of as gentle hedging words, because they show up constantly in natural English, and they help you sound relaxed rather than overly certain or overly formal about everything you say. For example, instead of a flat statement like, it's difficult, you could say, it's kind of difficult. Honestly, especially at the beginning, repeat that. It's kind of difficult. Honestly, especially at the beginning. Or, I sort of expected that. To be honest, repeat that. I sort of expected that. To be honest. These little hedges, kind of, sort of, aren't a sign of weak English at all. Quite the opposite. They're a sign of natural, comfortable, conversational English, the kind that native speakers use in nearly every single sentence without even noticing it. And once you start weaving them in yourself, your speech will immediately feel less stiff and more genuinely relaxed. And before we wrap everything up, I want to leave you with one more mindset reminder, because I think it might be the most important thing in this whole episode. You do not need to sound like a native speaker to sound confident. Those are actually two completely separate things. And so many learners tie their self-worth to the first one. Native-like perfection, when really, what matters in real conversations is the second one. Confidence, warmth, and the willingness to keep talking, even through a slight accent, even through the occasional grammar slip, even through a pause here and there while you search for a word. People connect with energy and personality far more than they notice small imperfections in grammar. So, give yourself permission, right now, today, to speak imperfectly and confidently at the exact same time. Because that combination, more than any single phrase we practice today, is genuinely what makes someone unforgettable in a conversation. Let's do a quick recap of everything we covered today. Because repetition really is the mother of fluency. And hearing these one more time will help them stick. We talked about introducing yourself with a bit of personality instead of just flat facts. Describing your daily routine using natural time expressions like usually and most days. Expressing opinions with variety, using phrases like in my opinion. And I'd say that. Agreeing and disagreeing politely and confidently. Talking about likes and preferences using into, and I'd rather, describing past experiences by combining present perfect and past simple naturally. Discussing problems and giving advice at different levels of directness, talking about future plans using going to, present continuous, and will, telling a simple, structured story using first, then, and in the end, connecting your ideas smoothly with because, so, although, and however, using natural filler words like, well, you know, actually, and I mean, avoiding some of the most common B1 mistakes and working on your pronunciation through sentence stress, question intonation, linking, and that soft schwa sound. We also went further and covered talking about your job and career in more depth, describing people's appearance and personality, expressing feelings and emotions with warmth, using hypothetical language like if I were you and I would, starting and ending small talk gracefully, talking about health, food, giving directions, discussing news and technology, expressing surprise, asking great follow-up questions, gracefully asking someone to repeat themselves, describing places, talking about weekend plans, and inviting others into group conversations. That is a genuinely huge amount of practical tools. And honestly, if you take even 4 or 5 of these and practice them consistently this week, you are going to notice a real, tangible difference in how confident you feel the next time you speak English out loud. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind you of something important. Confidence in a language doesn't come from knowing everything. It never does. Even for native speakers. Confidence comes from familiarity, from repetition, and from simply being willing to speak even when it's not perfect. Every single phrase we practice today, if you say it out loud a few times this week, in real conversations, or even just talking to yourself, it starts to become automatic. And once it's automatic, that's when it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like, well, just talking, which is exactly the goal. I also want to say something to those of you who might be listening to this episode more than once. Maybe you're re-listening right now, going back through the practice challenges a second or even a third time. And I just want to acknowledge that, because that kind of repetition is honestly exactly how fluency gets built. It's not glamorous. It's not flashy. It's just quiet, consistent repetition, over and over, until these phrases stop feeling like something you're borrowing from a podcast and start feeling like something that genuinely belongs to you. And if today's episode felt like a lot of information all at once, that's completely okay too. You don't need to master every single phrase we covered today immediately, or even this week. Pick 2 or 3 that felt the most useful to your actual life. The ones you know you'll actually use in real conversations. And focus on those first, really drilling them until they feel automatic. And then come back for the rest another time. Fluency isn't built in one single episode or one single week. It's built through this exact kind of steady, patient practice. Episode after episode, conversation after conversation. And I am genuinely honored to be part of that journey with you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today on English in Fluency. If this episode helped you, I would genuinely love it if you shared it with a friend who's also working on their English. Because learning together always makes the journey feel a little lighter and a lot more fun. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next episode, where we're going to keep building on exactly these skills, digging into even more real-life situations, more natural phrases, and more chances to practice speaking out loud together, right here on English in Fluency. Until then, keep practicing, keep speaking out loud, even when it feels a little uncomfortable. And remember, every confident speaker you admire started out exactly where you are right now. This has been Alex, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Take care. Keep practicing out loud whenever you get the chance, even for just a few minutes a day. And remember that every single conversation you have from here on out, however small, however imperfect, is another step toward the confident, fluent English speaker you are already well on your way to becoming. Keep talking.